You have 30 days to move out. That was the whole message. No greeting, no explanation, not even a name at the end. As if a stranger had typed it, as if my daughter had hired a collection agency to speak for her. I remember staring at the screen for a long time, trying to understand the tone. Was it anger? Was it exhaustion? Was it cruelty disguised as administrative efficiency? The little gray bubble on my phone blinked and vanished, leaving me in the same silence that had been growing between us for years. My first thought wasn't rage or disbelief. It was something quieter, something old, like a bruise pressed again after healing. I sat down in the chair by the window, the one that creaks when I lean too far to the left, and read it again. 30 days. I suppose she thought that was generous. I suppose she imagined me packing my few belongings neatly into boxes, labeling them Mom's things, and disappearing without a scene. She must have believed I had nowhere to turn, and maybe for a few seconds she was right. I'm 74. I live in what they call the back unit, converted garage, half kitchen, half storage, the smell of damp concrete never quite gone. I moved in 5 years ago, after her second pregnancy, when she said she needed help with the children and the mortgage. I remember that day clearly because she hugged me at the door and said, "You'll always have a place here, Mom." There was warmth in her voice then, or at least the memory of it. I unpacked slowly, put my dishes on the same shelf as hers, planted rosemary and mint by the small window. I believed I was part of their home. For years, I paid the utilities, watched the kids after school, cooked when she worked late. It was a quiet life, not grand, but full enough to feel like purpose. And now, all that had been reduced to a line of text. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. That's her way. When she doesn't want to sound cruel, she disappears behind silence. The grandchildren were at school, the house empty, the afternoon light stretching across the yard like a reminder of how big small spaces can feel when you're alone. I looked around my unit. The photos on the dresser, the cracked mug from our old house, the faded rug I'd brought from my marriage. Every item carried history, and every history now felt like evidence in a trial I hadn't realized was happening. I kept thinking of what might have led to this. The week before, she'd mentioned that the tenants down the street were paying $3,000 a month for a similar space. She'd said it absently, pouring coffee, not meeting my eyes. Her husband, Peter, had nodded. One of those nods that isn't agreement, but quiet encouragement. I'd laughed then, told her she should be proud of such a neighborhood. She hadn't laughed back. The truth is, it had been changing for a while. The air between us, the way she corrected me in front of the children, the way she rolled her eyes when I told stories from before she was born. Once, she said, "Mom, you always make everything sound like it happened in another century." I wanted to tell her that some things did, that memory ages differently when you carry it alone. But I just smiled. Mothers learn to smile at the edges of rejection. We pretend not to notice when our presence becomes inconvenient. We fold ourselves into corners, into small spaces, until one day, there's nowhere left to stand. And then comes the text. That evening, I made tea and sat outside by the little patch of rosemary I'd planted. The wind carried the sound of children playing from another yard. Someone else's laughter, not my grandchildren's. They'd stopped coming to my side of the house lately. "Mom says not to bother you," the oldest had whispered once, as if kindness were now a kind of trespass. I sipped my tea slowly, the bitterness clinging to the tongue, and watched the sun dip behind the roofs. I thought of calling my sister, but we haven't spoken in years. I thought of my late husband, but his voice only lives in the spaces between my own thoughts. So I sat with the text. I read it again and again until the words stopped sounding like language and became pure command. The strange part is I wasn't entirely surprised. There had been signs, small ones, easy to ignore. When she started calling me Mom in that distant tone, like a formal title rather than affection. When Peter began referring to the back unit as the rental. When my birthday passed without mention. They hadn't meant to be cruel, not at first, but cruelty often begins with convenience. You start by cutting corners, then people. You tell yourself it's practical. That's how kindness erodes, not in storms, but in weather. I turned off the light early that night, but sleep didn't come. I kept seeing the words on the screen behind my closed eyes, lit in the cold blue glow that makes everything look sterile. 30 days. As if my life could be scheduled between utility bills. I tried to remember the first time she'd said she loved me as a child, the way her voice sounded, whether it had been real or something I'd imagined. Memory betrays us when we need it most. I wanted to hate her, but what I felt instead was something worse. A dull sympathy for the kind of person she'd become. Successful, organized, efficient, and entirely hollow. I wondered if she even knew how much of herself she'd traded to appear respectable. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Peter's car starting. Through the small window, I saw her loading boxes into the trunk. Old toys, decorations, something wrapped in newspaper. I stepped outside, asked softly, "Moving something?" She startled, then smiled too quickly. "Just making room," she said. "For what?" "For the future," she answered and closed the trunk. That word, future, fell heavy between us. I wanted to ask if I was part of it, but I already knew the answer. She glanced at her phone, said she had a meeting, kissed my cheek out of habit, and drove off. The lipstick mark she left didn't feel like affection. It felt like punctuation. Inside, I made coffee and sat at the small table, the same one I'd bought for her first apartment decades ago. I ran my fingers over the scratches. Tiny etchings from her toddler years, when she'd banged spoons and demanded stories. The table had outlived patience, marriages, and dreams. I had, too. But now, for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake staying here. Maybe I had allowed love to turn into debt, and debt always has an expiration date. I picked up my phone again, opened her message one last time, and noticed something I hadn't before. She'd sent it at 7:14 a.m., early enough to be deliberate, late enough to avoid immediate confrontation. She wanted to control not just the outcome, but the timing of my hurt. That was her father's skill, too. Clean cruelty. All day I moved slowly, folding laundry that didn't need folding, washing cups already clean. I tried to imagine what leaving would mean. Where would I go? What could I afford? I'd given them so much over the years. My savings, my time, my quiet compliance. The irony is that she probably believes she's being generous, giving me 30 days. She doesn't know I still have the lease. She doesn't remember that. 5 years ago, when the landlord required a cosigner, I'd been the one to sign the papers. She was younger then, nervous about credit. I'd said, "Don't worry, darling. My name will give you stability." She'd hugged me then, the real kind of hug, the one that means need, not obligation. And I'd kept a copy of that lease, folded neatly in my file cabinet, with the rest of the life she thinks I've forgotten. Now, as I sit here, the afternoon light thin and gray, I realize that perhaps she's right. I will move out, but not the way she expects. Not as a discarded relic, not as a problem solved. When I leave, it will be because I've chosen to, not because she texted an order. I've lived long enough to know that silence can be both weapon and refuge. Mine will be the latter. I will not argue. I will not beg. I will simply begin again, one paper at a time. She thinks she's giving me 30 days to vanish. She doesn't understand that I only need one to remember who I am. When I finally confronted her, it wasn't dramatic. I waited until a Sunday morning when the air smelled faintly of detergent and burned toast, when Peter was in the yard pretending to prune bushes he didn't care about, and the children were still in their pajamas. She came into my unit to borrow the laundry detergent, moving quickly, eyes fixed on her phone, and I said, as calmly as I could, "I got your message." She froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. For a moment, I saw the flicker of guilt, the reflex of a daughter who knows she has crossed a line too far. But then it passed. "I didn't mean for it to sound harsh," she said, her voice smooth like someone reading off a script. "It's just, we've been thinking about boundaries, about space. The kids are older now. We all need room to grow." I wanted to ask her if she really thought growth came from exile, but the words wouldn't form. I stood by the sink, hands wet from rinsing a cup, and she kept talking, stringing phrases she'd probably rehearsed in her head all week. "You know how it is, Mom. Families change. Peter and I talked about it for months. We just think it's healthier this way. You deserve your own space, too." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the lie was so painfully obvious. My own space. I'd had my own space before she needed a babysitter, before she needed my credit, before she decided my presence was inconvenient for the image she'd built. When I didn't answer, she stepped closer, softening her tone. "Please don't make this hard," she said. "We'll help you find something. Peter can ask around. There are good senior apartments near the park." I stared at her, at the careful neutrality of her expression, and it struck me that she had practiced this moment. She'd probably imagined how I'd react, perhaps even cried beforehand to purge any visible emotion. Everything about her face said preparation, not remorse. "It's legal, Mom," she added, as if that ended the discussion. "You're not on the lease. Technically, this isn't even your unit." I set the cup down and turned off the faucet, listening to the steady drip that followed. "Not on the lease?" I repeated. She nodded quickly, eager to be done. "It was never official, just an understanding." "I mean, you didn't want the paperwork, remember?" I looked at her then, really looked, and realized she truly believed it. Or maybe she wanted to. That's how revision works. You repeat something long enough, and it becomes your truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said, "All right," and watched confusion flicker across her face. She expected resistance, maybe tears. What she didn't expect was stillness. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it," I said. She nodded, relieved, mistaking my calm for surrender. She took her detergent, mumbled a thank you, and left. I heard the door to the main house close, the muffled hum of her voice mixing with Peter's outside. I sat down at the table, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from clarity. The kind that comes when you realize someone has rewritten your story while you were living it. For the rest of that day, I moved like a shadow in my own space, seeing everything differently. The cracked tiles I'd repaired, the curtains I'd hemmed, the shelves I'd built. Every small fix was evidence of care, of investment. I remembered how the unit looked when I first arrived. Bare walls, concrete floor, exposed wiring. She had apologized then, said they'd finish it when things settled down. I spent my savings turning that unfinished space into a home. Painted the walls myself. Bought a small refrigerator. Even installed a heater one winter when the children were sick, and she couldn't afford it. I never asked to be reimbursed. I never needed thanks. It was my family, my duty. But now, looking around, all I saw was how quietly people can take from you until there's nothing left that isn't theirs. That evening, after they'd gone out to dinner, I opened the old filing cabinet I keep in the corner by the window. It's dented and squeaks when pulled, a leftover from my nursing days, full of decades of documents, birth certificates, tax forms, a few letters from my late husband. I still can't read without trembling. Near the back, beneath a stack of faded utility receipts, was a beige envelope labeled House. I remembered sealing it years ago when we first moved here, thinking I'd keep it for reference. Inside was the lease agreement, printed neatly on thick paper, the kind landlords still preferred before everything went digital. My hands shook a little as I unfolded it. There, right under the bold heading, were two names: Jennifer Miles and Evelyn Ross. Hers first, mine second, both signed in black ink. I traced the curve of my own signature, slow and deliberate, as if reintroducing myself to my own existence. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't some guest or squatter. I was legally bound to this property. I sat there for a long time, staring at the page, the air around me thick with something that wasn't quite victory. Not yet. It was recognition. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without leaving the lamp on. I dreamt of nothing, which was its own kind of peace. The next morning, she came by again, chirping like nothing had happened. "We'll start looking for places for you this week," she said. "There's a nice senior living community near the lake. Maybe they'll have bingo nights." I smiled politely, sipping my coffee. "You always did like organizing people," I said. "It's one of your talents." She frowned slightly, sensing something off. "I just want this to go smoothly, Mom." "Of course," I said. "Smooth is good." She nodded, reassured, and left. She had no idea that the smoothness she desired would come from my silence, not compliance. After she left, I made a list, not of places to move, but of people to call. At the top was the landlord, Mr. Sandoval, a quiet man who preferred email but tolerated phone calls from me because, as he once said, "You're the only one who actually reads the contract." When he picked up, his tone was neutral until I introduced myself properly. "This is Evelyn Ross," I said, "co-tenant at 1825 Willow Street." A pause followed, then polite surprise. "Oh, yes, Mrs. Ross. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to confirm that the lease is still current, both signatures active." He cleared his throat, shuffled papers on his end. "Yes, ma'am. It auto-renews annually. Both parties listed." "So, if one wanted to terminate the arrangement," I continued, "both would have to sign, correct?" "Correct," he said. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," I replied, smiling into the receiver. "Just keeping my records up to date." When we hung up, I sat back in the chair and exhaled slowly. The air in the room felt lighter, sharper. It's strange how power can return to you in such small, bureaucratic ways. One minute you're being dismissed as irrelevant, and the next you're holding proof that someone underestimated your memory. I didn't feel triumphant exactly, but I did feel awake. I made a copy of the lease, placed it in a new envelope, and labeled it. For later. Then I slid the original back into the drawer and locked it. That simple click felt louder than any argument could have. In the days that followed, she grew distant but polite, as if preparing for my exit. I played along. I made dinner when asked, smiled at the children, watered the plants. I became the ghost she wanted me to be, but I was a ghost taking notes. I noticed how she whispered with Peter at night, how she avoided mentioning the word lease again, how she started leaving rental listings on my counter, pretending it was helpful. It almost amused me. They thought I was powerless, that old women forget the laws they helped raise their children under. They didn't realize that when you've spent a lifetime signing permission slips and legal waivers and medical forms, you learn to read fine print better than anyone. The catalyst wasn't her cruelty. It was my recognition that the paper in my hand was more than protection. It was a map. I could stay, legally, for as long as I chose, but staying would mean living under the same roof of contempt. The real act of power wasn't to win the argument. It was to choose the battlefield. I decided then that I wouldn't just remain out of spite. I would move, but on my own terms. I would find a place where my name didn't need a second signature to exist. That night, I heard laughter from their side of the house, the easy kind, wine-soaked and relieved. They thought it was settled, that I'd quietly begin packing soon. I closed my window to mute the sound, but not before hearing Peter say, "We'll list it next month. It'll rent fast." So that was their plan. They wanted my home before I even left it. I smiled in the dark, not bitterly, but with the knowledge of someone who's already several steps ahead. Tomorrow, I would make another call, not to plead, not to fight, but to begin arranging my own escape. They had forgotten that I, too, know how to plan. They had forgotten that once upon a time, before I was someone's mother, someone's wife, I was a woman who could build a life out of nothing but willpower and a stack of forms. They had forgotten, but I hadn't. The quiet worsened in the way only domestic silence can, that subtle, invisible thickening of air between people who have already made a decision, but are still pretending to be civil. After that Sunday, my daughter stopped coming to the back unit altogether. She used to drop in every morning with her coffee, talking about her meetings, the children's schedules, what to thaw for dinner. Now she just texted, short, utilitarian sentences. "Kids home late. Leave gate unlocked. Peter fixed the sprinkler." No greetings, no small talk. Even her ellipses disappeared. Her voice became punctuation. When she passed me in the yard, she smiled with her lips but not her eyes. The kind of smile people give cashiers. Peter barely looked at me at all. He had started parking in a different spot, farther from my window, as if physical distance could erase moral unease. The grandchildren still waved when they saw me, but always checking first to see if their mother was watching. I pretended not to notice. There are only so many times a person can ask to be seen. At first, I thought maybe I could endure it. I told myself it was temporary, that she would come to her senses, that this was stress or confusion, that motherhood at 40 had hardened her in ways I didn't understand. I busied myself with small tasks, washing curtains, trimming the rosemary, baking bread I knew they wouldn't eat. I left loaves by their door anyway, because that's what I'd always done. The first two disappeared without comment. The third stayed there all day until the ants found it. That was the moment I understood the shift was permanent. What had been affection was now obligation. What had been home was now tolerated presence. Sometimes at night, I'd hear muffled conversations from the main house. Their voices were low, but the tone was unmistakable. That anxious mixture of guilt and justification. The phrases floated through the walls like tiny knives. "She'll be fine. It's not sustainable. We can't live like this forever." Each word was followed by the clinking of dishes, the sound of normalcy reasserting itself. I would lie awake, tracing the cracks in the ceiling with my eyes, feeling something inside me detach slowly, like a thread unspooling from an old sweater. I didn't cry. There's a dignity in dry sorrow that tears can't reach. A week later, a letter arrived addressed to me but written in my daughter's handwriting, the neat cursive she used only when she wanted to appear thoughtful. It wasn't mailed. It had been slipped under my door. The note was brief, full of euphemisms. She called the eviction a transition. She said it was time for a new chapter and thanked me for my support over the years. She enclosed a brochure for a retirement complex and underlined the phrase, "Independent Living Community." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Independent after 40 years of being the scaffold for her life. Independence was the one luxury I had forgotten how to want. Days blurred into each other. She stopped including me in family meals. On Sundays, I'd watch them load the car for outings without even pretending to invite me. Once I caught my reflection in their kitchen window as they reversed out of the driveway. I was standing in the garden, clutching a dish towel like a flag of truce. The car turned the corner, and I lowered it slowly, embarrassed by my own hope. Invisibility doesn't happen all at once. It's incremental, like frost spreading across glass. The final proof of my exclusion came one afternoon when a delivery van arrived. 2 men carried in new furniture, sleek, modern, in that pale wood color that never stains because no one touches it. I watched from my window as they carried out my old sofa, the one I'd given her when she first moved in with Peter. It had been mine since before she was born. A sturdy thing with faded blue fabric and a dip in the cushion from years of reading. I remember nursing her on that couch, her tiny head resting on my arm as we watched late-night television. Now I saw it being dragged out to the curb like trash. She stood in the doorway giving instructions, her hair tied back, efficient, composed. When the movers left, she didn't even glance at me. Later that evening, I walked outside pretending to take out the trash and stood over the discarded couch. The air smelled faintly of rain. I ran my hand over the worn armrest, and for a moment, the years folded in on themselves. I wanted to drag it back inside, but pride stopped me. I turned and walked away. The next morning, she knocked on my door, cheerful but tense. "Peter and I are going to repaint the fence," she said, her tone rehearsed. "Could you keep the kids inside while we work?" I nodded. She hesitated. "Also, please don't use the main laundry anymore. We just had it serviced, and it's delicate." Delicate, I thought, like their consciences. "Of course," I said. She smiled, relieved by my compliance. Later that day, I washed my clothes by hand in the sink, the way my grandmother used to, wringing each shirt carefully, hanging them on a line in the corner of my unit. There was a strange satisfaction in it, an act of self-sufficiency disguised as punishment. At night, the grandchildren sometimes slipped into my unit before bedtime. The younger one, Ella, brought her stuffed rabbit. The older one, Sam, whispered, "Mom says we shouldn't bother you." I told him softly, "You're never a bother." They'd stay a few minutes giggling under the blanket, whispering secrets about school. I cherished those moments, but each time they left more quickly, glancing toward the main house like fugitives. Eventually, even that stopped. One evening, I heard Ella crying through the wall. Her mother's voice followed, stern and low. "You can't run to Grandma every time you're upset. You have to learn boundaries." That word again, boundaries. Such a clean word for such a dirty act. Around that time, Peter began locking the gate between our units. I found out one morning when I tried to bring in the mail. The latch had a new padlock on it. No note, no explanation. I had to walk around the block to reach the front door. When I finally asked about it, my daughter said, "Oh, it's for security. You never know these days." I wanted to ask, security from whom? But I already knew the answer. She was securing herself from me, from my history, from my presence, from the mirror I held up that she didn't want to look into. The air inside my unit grew heavier with each passing day. Dust settled on the shelves faster, as if the house itself was trying to bury me. I stopped opening the curtains because the light felt intrusive. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, smaller somehow, thinner, as if the space itself was consuming me. Sometimes I'd catch the faint sound of laughter from their side and realize I no longer knew what they were laughing about. It was like listening to a radio from another life. But something inside me was changing too. Beneath the ache, there was a slow gathering of resolve. I began sorting through my things, not because I accepted their deadline, but because I wanted to see what still belonged to me. Old photo albums, letters from my husband, the recipe cards written in my mother's hand, pieces of a self I had abandoned in service to everyone else. I found a shoebox full of bills and notes I'd kept from when I helped Jennifer buy her first car. She had forgotten, of course, that I'd co-signed that loan too. I realized then that this wasn't new. This was a pattern. Me as the foundation, her as the house that kept repainting its walls to forget what held it up. One afternoon while she was at work, I walked through the garden and noticed she'd pulled out the mint I'd planted. The soil was freshly turned, the roots scattered. In its place, she'd planted ornamental grasses, neat, sterile, efficient. I knelt, picked up one of the uprooted stems, and held it in my palm. It still smelled like summer, like dinners on the porch, like laughter before it turned brittle. I slipped it into my pocket. Later, I pressed it between the pages of my lease copy. A small rebellion, a reminder that roots can survive removal if you know where to hide them. Weeks passed, and the tension settled into routine. We lived like polite strangers sharing a fence. I stopped speaking first. She stopped pretending to care. The only communication between us was through notes, reminders about utilities, recycling, schedules. Each message was shorter than the last. One day, I realized that she had started signing them not Love Jen, but simply J. I knew what that meant. Erasure begins with initials. Still, I kept my face calm when we crossed paths. I even offered to help when she complained about bills, though I knew she would refuse. She always did. But the offer itself reminded me that generosity is a choice, and I still had choices. I began to set aside money quietly, small amounts from my pension, cashing checks instead of depositing them. I hid the envelopes under the drawer liner in my dresser. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It felt like oxygen returning to lungs long denied. The slow cruelty of those weeks did not break me. It clarified me. Each ignored word, each closed door, each unacknowledged kindness stripped away another illusion. I stopped expecting apology or understanding. What remained was sharper, steadier. I began to look outward, to imagine other places where my voice wouldn't echo unanswered. I walked through the neighborhood pretending to admire the houses, but really I was studying the for rent signs, making mental notes. No one suspected. To them, I was the aging mother finally accepting her fate. They didn't see the calculation behind my quiet gaze. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the roofs, I stood at the edge of the driveway and looked back at the house. The one I'd helped buy, paint, furnish. The windows glowed warmly, framing a family scene I was no longer part of. But instead of grief, I felt something else. Relief. I realized that I didn't belong there anymore, not because they'd said so, but because the version of me who had belonged was already gone. The woman who once waited to be invited inside was done waiting. I turned toward the street, where the shadows stretched long and open, and I walked until the house disappeared behind the hedges. I wasn't leaving yet. Not physically. But something in me already had. The first change began not with a declaration, but with an impulse so small it could have passed for distraction. One morning, I woke before sunrise, the house still asleep, and found myself restless, pacing between the sink and the window, unable to sit still under the slow drip of silence that had become my companion. I boiled water, brewed coffee in the chipped pot Peter had once mocked for smelling like old times, and sat at the table with the lease spread before me like a confession. The paper had yellowed at the edges, the ink fading slightly, but my name was still there. Clear, solid, legal. I studied the signature until it steadied me. For months they had made me feel temporary, as if my existence depended on their kindness. Yet here, in plain type, was proof that I had rights no text message could erase. It was not revenge I felt blooming in my chest, but something rarer, self-respect, waking up from a long sleep. I folded the lease, slipped it into a new envelope, and tucked it into my purse. That single motion, so quiet, so ordinary, felt like reclaiming a voice I hadn't used in years. I decided to leave the house that day, not for errands or groceries, but simply to walk without purpose. The sky was a low gray, the kind that promises rain but rarely delivers it, and the streets smelled of wet pavement and old leaves. I walked past the familiar rows of suburban houses, identical in their perfection, each with manicured lawns and security cameras blinking like watchful eyes. For the first time in months, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I walked until my knees protested, then found a bench outside a small cafe I'd never noticed before. The place was modest, with mismatched chairs and a handwritten sign that said, "Cash preferred, but kindness accepted." That line made me smile. I went inside and ordered tea. The young woman at the counter looked surprised when I paid in coins, not because of the money, but because I spoke to her as if she mattered. We chatted briefly about the weather, her classes, the pastries she'd baked at dawn. I sat by the window and drank slowly, savoring the warmth that wasn't just from the cup. It felt good to be somewhere that didn't define me by relation, mother, grandmother, nuisance. Just a woman having tea. I left $1 on the table and walked home lighter. That night, I made a plan. Not an elaborate one, but something real enough to hold on to. I would not argue with them. I would not beg, and I would not be evicted like a stranger. I would stay until I was ready. And when I left, it would be on my terms, with my head high and my name intact. I began to organize my life in small, deliberate gestures. I sorted my papers into folders, bank statements, pension slips, the deed of my late husband's insurance policy. I called the bank and updated my address to my unit's number, rather than the main house. I even bought a new phone, one they didn't know about. A simple flip model that felt almost comforting in its old-fashioned logic. I stored the landlord's number, the cafe's address, and a note to myself that read, "You still belong somewhere." Each of these actions was like a match struck in the dark, faint but growing brighter with repetition. When I met with the landlord, Mr. Sandoval, it was under the guise of routine. I wore my neatest coat, the gray wool one that still carried the faint scent of cedar from years in storage, and took the bus downtown. His office was small, cluttered with folders and half-dead plants. He looked surprised when I introduced myself in person, but he quickly recovered, offering coffee and a seat. We spoke politely about the property, about minor repairs, about the importance of documentation. I could see curiosity flicker in his eyes when I mentioned my co-tenancy. "I didn't realize you were still living there," he said. "Jennifer handles all the payments now." I smiled. "I know, she's efficient. But my name remains on the lease, correct?" He nodded, tapping at his computer. "Yes, ma'am. It's all current." "Good," I said. "I just wanted to ensure clarity in case there are misunderstandings." He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Is everything all right at home?" I considered lying, but honesty felt cleaner. "Everything is accurate on paper," I said, "and that's all that matters for now." He nodded, the kind of nod that says, "I understand more than I should." When I left, I felt steadier. The city air smelled of exhaust and damp cement, but it was the smell of movement, not confinement. Returning home, I found Peter in the driveway, shirt sleeves rolled up, arguing on the phone about something trivial. He glanced at me and nodded curtly, eyes full of the impatience of men who fear what they can't control. I smiled back, polite, unreadable. Inside my unit, I opened my purse, removed the lease, and placed it in a drawer under my clothes. Then I began to write. A list, a plan, a small declaration to myself. I would give notice to the landlord when the time came, not to them. I would not leave under duress, and before I went, I would make sure the truth was documented somewhere beyond their reach. It wasn't vengeance, it was record-keeping. The quiet insistence that my side of the story would exist in ink. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the house shifted in ways only people who live close enough to resent each other can sense. My daughter grew strangely cordial, almost cheerful, as if trying to rewrite history through tone alone. She began dropping off small gestures, a bowl of soup, folded laundry, a new blanket she claimed she'd bought for the guest room. I accepted each offering with the same polite distance she once used with me. We were both actors in a play neither of us believed in anymore. Peter avoided me altogether, though once I caught him checking the lock on the side gate again, his fingers fidgeting nervously, as if guilt might jam the mechanism. The children, confused by the changing rules, kept their distance. I missed their laughter, but I also understood the cruelty of turning them into messengers of adult cowardice. I preferred their absence to their unease. In solitude, I began to rediscover the rhythm of being alive without permission. I started taking longer walks, sometimes riding the bus to neighborhoods I'd never visited. I found a library a few miles away and spent hours among the shelves, reading travel books about places I would never go but still wanted to imagine. I borrowed a small notebook and began jotting down phrases that came to me, fragments of thought, memories, recipes, bits of advice I'd never had the courage to give my daughter. Writing steadied me. It turned pain into shape, made the abstract weight of betrayal tangible, measurable, manageable. One afternoon, I wrote in that notebook, "She may own the house, but I own the memory of every nail I hammered, every meal I cooked under that roof. And memories are the one property no one can repossess." Around that time, I returned to the cafe. The young woman recognized me and smiled, calling me Miss Evelyn, as if we were old acquaintances. She asked about my week, and I told her I was taking care of paperwork. She nodded knowingly, as if paperwork were a language all women eventually learn to speak to survive. I stayed longer that day, reading the newspaper, people watching, listening to the soft hum of conversations around me. I realized how starved I'd been for the simple background noise of other lives, how the domestic isolation had tricked me into thinking invisibility was safety. It wasn't. It was suffocation disguised as politeness. Before I left, I asked the girl if she knew of any small rentals nearby. She thought for a moment, then scribbled a number on a napkin. "My aunt rents rooms sometimes," she said. "It's not fancy, but it's quiet." I folded the napkin carefully and placed it in my purse next to the lease. 2 pieces of paper, equally powerful in different ways, one binding me to the past, one pointing to possibility. That evening, as the sky dimmed and the first drops of rain began to fall, I stood at my window, watching the lights flicker on in the main house. Through the half-drawn curtains, I saw my daughter setting the table, Peter uncorking a bottle of wine, the children running circles around them. They looked content, framed by the glow of a life they believed was theirs alone. I didn't feel envy anymore. What I felt was clarity. They could have the house, the furniture, the illusion of order. I had something better: knowledge. I knew exactly where I stood, both legally and morally, and that made me untouchable in a way they couldn't comprehend. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet certainty that you can leave whenever you choose. Before bed, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Freedom doesn't always come from escape. Sometimes it comes from remembering that the door was never locked." I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and lay back, listening to the rain tapping gently against the roof. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an occupant. I felt like the architect of my own exit. It began with a misunderstanding that wasn't really a misunderstanding at all, more like a collision of secrets that had been waiting to happen. I had gone to the post office one morning, intending to send a letter to the pension office confirming my new mailing address, when I saw Peter standing in line ahead of me, holding a stack of envelopes. He didn't notice me at first, or maybe he pretended not to, but I saw the name on the top one. It was addressed to the landlord. When he reached the counter, I heard him say, in that too loud voice people use when they want to sound confident, "Yes, this is for the termination notice effective next month." My pulse slowed rather than quickened. I waited until he left before stepping up to the same counter, asking quietly, "Could I have the return address for the previous customer?" The clerk shook her head politely. "Sorry, ma'am, that's private." I smiled. Of course it is. I didn't need the address anyway. I knew where the letters would end up. When I came home, the air around the house had changed, tighter somehow, as if the walls themselves knew what was being plotted. My daughter was in the kitchen, her voice low, sharp around the edges. She hung up as soon as she saw me and forced a smile that cracked halfway. "Oh, Mom, I didn't expect you back so soon," she said. "You should have called. I could have picked up milk for you." The lie was graceless. Her hands fidgeted on the counter, restless. There were papers spread out, brochures for home renovations, design samples, a contractor's business card. "We're thinking of remodeling," she said too quickly, "expanding the living room." I looked at the papers, then at her. "Expanding or replacing?" I asked softly. She went still, her jaw tightening. "Mom, please don't start." "Start what?" I said. "A conversation? You sent Peter to the post office to file a termination notice for a lease that doesn't belong to him. I think we're already well past starting." Her face changed then, like a mask slipping. "How do you know about that?" she demanded. "Because I pay attention," I said. "Something you might try once in a while." Her eyes flashed, not with guilt, but with panic. The panic of someone whose carefully constructed version of events is starting to crumble. "You can't keep living like this," she said. "It's not normal, you being out there, depending on us hanging around." "Depending on you?" I interrupted, and this time I couldn't keep my voice even. "I pay half the utilities. I buy groceries. I fix what your husband breaks." "You depend on me, Jennifer. You always have. You just stopped noticing when it became inconvenient to admit it." She looked away, her throat working. "It's not about money," she said, a line rehearsed. "It's about space, privacy, boundaries." That word again, the weapon she wielded when she wanted to sound righteous. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Boundaries in a house built on my credit. "Then by all means," I said quietly, "draw your lines. Just remember who owns the paper you're drawing them on." She went pale. "What are you talking about?" I stepped closer, placed the folded lease on the counter between us, and opened it with deliberate care. "This," I said. "Do you recognize it?" Her eyes darted over the page, searching for some loophole that would make it disappear. "You kept this?" she whispered. "Of course I did," I said. "I keep everything." "That's what mothers do. They keep what their children throw away." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked. The air between us solidified into something brittle. Finally, she said, "You're using this against me?" "I'm using this to protect myself," I replied. "You made this a battlefield, not me." Later that evening, Peter came knocking, the kind of knock men use when they think volume equals authority. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. He held himself stiffly, all contained irritation and performative patience. "We need to talk," he said. "So talk," I replied. "Inside." "No," I said. "Here is fine." He sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose like a man dealing with unreasonable children. "You're making things difficult," he said. "Jennifer's been under a lot of stress lately. You being here, it's not helping. We just want peace in our home." "Your home," I said evenly, "rests on my signature." That startled him. I could see the calculation flicker across his face. "She told me you weren't on the lease," he said slowly. "She was mistaken." "So what? What's your plan?" he asked. "You gonna stay forever? Make us miserable until one of us dies?" I met his gaze without blinking. "No," I said. "I'm going to leave when I choose. And before I do, I'll make sure the landlord knows who's been violating sublease clauses and using rental property for unapproved renovations." His mouth opened, closed, then twisted into a forced smile. "You wouldn't do that," he said. "That would hurt Jen. You love her." I felt a strange calm then, the kind that comes when fear finally burns itself out. Love? I said. Yes. I loved her enough to give her everything she has. Now I love myself enough to stop. I closed the door slowly but firmly, the click of the latch echoing like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. After that, the house turned cold in a way no heater could fix. Jennifer avoided me entirely, sending Peter to deliver messages, dropping envelopes at my door like peace treaties written by cowards. The children were kept away to avoid tension. At night, I heard whispered arguments, drawers slamming, the sound of things being packed and unpacked. Once, I caught sight of her through the kitchen window, crying silently, while Peter stood over her, talking fast, his gestures sharp. I didn't feel satisfaction, only a heavy sadness that came from realizing she was trapped too. Trapped by pride, by the image she'd built of a perfect family that couldn't survive the truth of its foundations. Days passed like that, thick with avoidance. I focused on preparing quietly. I began boxing up my belongings, labeling each one in small, careful handwriting. Books, linens, records. Each label was a statement of ownership, a quiet reminder that I was not leaving empty-handed. I contacted Mr. Sandoval again, this time by email. I wrote, "Per our conversation, please consider this notice of intent to vacate, effective at the end of next month. I will ensure the property is left in good condition. Kindly confirm receipt." His reply came within the hour. "Received, Mrs. Ross. Wishing you well." I printed that email and placed it in my folder. Paper had become my armor. When Jennifer finally confronted me again, it was almost a relief. She came into my unit unannounced, her face flushed, eyes rimmed red. "You went to the landlord," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I informed him I'll be leaving." She blinked, confused. You're really going?" "Of course," I said. "You wanted me out. I'm giving you what you wanted." "But," she stammered, "you're doing it like this, behind our backs?" "Behind your backs?" I repeated. "You sent a termination notice behind mine. I'm simply finishing what you started." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, like a child caught lying. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said finally. "I just needed space." "You could have asked for that," I said. "Instead, you evicted your mother." She looked at me then, and for a moment I saw the girl she used to be, small and uncertain, the one who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. "I didn't think you'd fight back," she whispered. "That's the problem," I said. "You never thought I would." After she left, I sat down at my table, the same one that had borne witness to every humiliation, and wrote a letter. Not to her, not to the landlord, but to myself. It was part confession, part reminder. "Evelyn," it began, "you are not leaving in defeat. You are leaving as a woman who has finally learned that endurance is not the same as love. You have kept records, paid bills, raised children, and survived dismissals dressed as concern. You have nothing to prove. Walk out the door with your spine straight and your name unbent." I folded the letter and tucked it into my purse beside the lease. The next week, things escalated in ways neither of us had anticipated. Peter's voice grew louder, angrier, as the renovation plans stalled and money grew tight. He stopped acknowledging me entirely, though once, late at night, I heard him mutter something through the thin walls. "She's doing this to spite us." I almost wanted to correct him, to tell him spite would have required caring enough to hurt them. What I was doing was simpler: self-preservation. Jennifer began avoiding the house altogether, spending long hours at work, coming home only after the children were asleep. I started leaving early in the mornings, walking to the cafe or sitting in the park, anywhere but here. It wasn't escape. It was practice for departure. One afternoon, as I was returning, I found the lock on my door changed. My hands trembled as I tried the key again, then again, the metal scraping uselessly. I stood there for a long time, staring at the brass glinting in the sun. When I finally knocked on the main door, Peter opened it, feigning confusion. "Oh," he said, "we thought you'd already left." My voice came out low but steady. "You changed my lock." "It was a mistake," he said too quickly. "The handyman must have—" "Don't," I said sharply. "Just don't." I turned and walked away before he could speak again. My legs shook, but my steps were deliberate. At the corner, I pulled out my phone and called Mr. Sandoval. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Sandoval," I said calmly, "this is Evelyn Ross. I'd like to report an illegal lock change on a co-tenant's unit." His tone changed instantly. "I'll handle it," he said. "You have my word." That night, he called back to confirm he'd spoken to them, that the lock would be replaced, that such behavior violated tenancy law. The next morning, Peter left for work early, face tight with fury, and the new lock was installed by noon. I watched through the window as the handyman worked, feeling something in me settle. I had been silenced for months, but now every turn of that screwdriver sounded like a sentence being rewritten in my favor. The final confrontation came 2 days later. Jennifer showed up at my door, pale and trembling. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You're humiliating us." I met her eyes. "No," I said softly. "I'm teaching you." "Teaching me what?" "That love isn't servitude, that mothers have limits, that silence isn't consent." She looked as though she might cry, but no tears came. Instead, she whispered, "I just wanted control." "You had it," I said. "You used it to erase me." There was nothing more to say after that. She turned and walked away, leaving the door ajar behind her, the faint sound of her sobs blending with the wind outside. That night I finished packing. I labeled the last box. Kitchen. I folded the last blanket. I stood in the center of the room and looked around at the bare walls, the pale outline where pictures had hung. It wasn't sadness I felt, but completion, like the pause after the final note of a long song. I picked up my purse, checked that the lease and letter were still inside, and sat quietly until dawn. In the early morning light, I heard birds for the first time in weeks, faint but insistent, as if reminding me that the world continued beyond the narrow fences of this place. I knew then that when I walked out tomorrow, I wouldn't just be leaving a house. I'd be leaving the idea that love means staying no matter what. I'd be walking into something undefined, but fully mine, and that uncertainty no longer frightened me. It felt like freedom wearing new clothes. The morning I left was bright and cold, a kind of false spring that makes you believe the air is gentler than it is. I woke before dawn, as I had done all my life, and sat for a moment on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet expand until it felt almost solid. The night before, I had lined up the boxes neatly by the door, taped and labeled, each one a small history of a life that had been lived twice, once for others, once in secret for myself. I had already called the taxi, arranged the movers, and signed the papers for my new apartment. Everything was ready, except the goodbye I didn't intend to say. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing by the window. The house across the yard was still dark, its windows blank, its walls holding the kind of silence that follows arguments no one wins. I didn't feel anger anymore. What I felt was a clarity so sharp it bordered on peace. For months I had been a ghost in this place. That morning, I was the ghost leaving, not the one being exorcised. I dressed carefully, the way one dresses for a final conversation. My best slacks, the pale blue blouse I used to wear to work, and my gray wool coat, the one I'd worn the day I signed the lease with her. I pinned my hair back, applied lipstick for the first time in months, and looked at myself in the mirror without flinching. I didn't look old. I looked complete, which is rarer. By the time I finished, the light was starting to shift. I placed my purse on the table, the envelope with the lease and letter tucked inside, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The door to the main house opened just after 7. Peter's voice was the first thing I heard, impatient, clipped. "She's not answering her phone," he said. Then my daughter's voice, softer, cautious. "She won't leave, Peter. She'll drag this out." I almost smiled. They still didn't understand that I was already gone. A moment later, there was a knock, firm, rehearsed. I opened the door before the second one came. Jennifer stood there, eyes red, hair unbrushed, wearing the robe I'd bought her years ago. Behind her, Peter loomed like a shadow, pretending to be moral authority. I stepped aside without invitation. "Come in," I said. "I was just waiting for you." They looked around the room, at the boxes, at the bare shelves, at the empty table. Confusion flickered across their faces, followed by unease. Peter was the first to speak. "You packed," he said. "Yes," I said. "I told you I would." Jennifer frowned. "You can't just walk away. We need to discuss this." "Discuss what?" I asked. "You wanted me gone. I'm leaving. Consider it an act of obedience." My tone was calm, measured, too calm for Peter's liking. He stepped forward. "You've been talking to the landlord. You made him threaten us with violations." "He didn't threaten you," I said. "He informed you. There's a difference." "You had no right," he snapped. "On the contrary," I said, reaching for my purse. "I have exactly the right. Would you like to see it?" I took out the envelope, unfolded the lease, and placed it on the counter between us, like a declaration of independence. "Here," I said. 2 names. One of them mine. Still valid. Still enforceable. I could have stayed for another year if I wanted to, and there's not a thing you could have done about it. They stared at the paper, as if it were an accusation. "You kept this all these years?" Jennifer whispered. "Of course," I said. "A woman who doesn't keep proof of her existence ends up living at the mercy of those who forget she built the roof over their heads." Peter leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to look composed, but failing. "So what now?" he asked. "You're moving out, but you want to make sure we feel guilty first?" His sarcasm was as thin as his patience. "No," I said. "I don't want you to feel anything. I just want you to remember this moment exactly as it is. You tried to erase me, and I refused. That's all." Jennifer moved closer, her voice trembling. "Mom, please don't do this like it's revenge. I never wanted it to end like this." I met her gaze and saw the small, frightened girl she'd once been. hiding behind the woman who had learned to negotiate love like a contract. "Neither did I said softly. "But you started it with a text message." Her mouth opened, then closed again, as if words had finally abandoned her. "You have no idea what it's like," she said suddenly. "To feel trapped, to have your own mother living with you, watching everything you do, judging every mistake." "I wasn't judging," I interrupted. "I was present." "That's what frightened you." For a long time we stood there, 3 people in a room stripped bare of furniture, but crowded with everything unsaid. The air was thick with old debts and the weight of unacknowledged gratitude. Finally, I reached into my purse again and pulled out 2 envelopes. I handed the first to Jennifer. "This is for you," I said. "My notice to vacate, officially signed and dated. You can show it to whoever you need to." Then I handed the second to Peter. "And this one," I said, "is a certified copy of the lease. Your copy, since you seem to have misplaced the original." He took it reluctantly, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why give us this?" he asked. "Because I don't want you to pretend you were blindsided," I said. "I'm leaving, but I won't leave as a ghost. I'll leave documented." The silence that followed was almost beautiful. It was the silence of realization, the sound of people understanding too late what they had underestimated. Jennifer's eyes filled, but didn't spill. Peter muttered something under his breath about drama, but even he knew the fight was over. I closed my purse, took one last look around the room, and said, "The movers will be here in an hour. I'll handle the rest." Jennifer took a step toward me. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere smaller," I said. "Somewhere that doesn't owe me an apology every time I open a window." She tried to speak again, but the words came out as a sob. I wanted to reach for her, to comfort her the way I used to. But I stopped myself. There are goodbyes that require restraint more than affection. "Take care of yourself," I said, "and the children. They'll need to know what this really means one day." When they left, I sat down for a moment, listening to the faint sound of their voices fading through the yard. I thought I might cry, but the tears wouldn't come. It wasn't grief I felt. It was release, the strange lightness that comes when a long story finally finds its ending. The taxi arrived just as the first sunlight hit the driveway. The driver was a young man who smiled politely, but didn't speak much. He loaded the boxes carefully, one by one, and I watched as each piece of my life disappeared into the trunk. Before getting in, I turned back toward the house one last time. The curtains in the kitchen window moved slightly, Jennifer watching, perhaps, or just the wind playing tricks. Either way, I didn't wave. Farewells lose meaning when spoken to people who stopped listening long ago. The drive to my new apartment took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing an entire lifetime. The city unfolded around me. Streets I hadn't walked in years, neighborhoods that smelled of bakeries and rain. I saw a flower shop on the corner near the building, its windows fogged from humidity. That would be my landmark now, I decided, something alive to greet me each morning. When we arrived, the driver helped me carry the boxes upstairs to the small second-floor flat. The place was modest but full of light. 2 windows facing east, the walls freshly painted white. I set the boxes by the wall, paid the fare, and closed the door behind me. For a moment, the silence was almost too pure to bear. Then I exhaled and began to move slowly through the space, touching each surface, grounding myself in the newness. I unpacked methodically, not out of necessity, but as a way to mark the transition. my clothes in the small closet, my dishes in the cupboard, my books stacked neatly on the windowsill. When I reached the box labeled kitchen, I found the teapot my mother had given me decades ago, its handle chipped, its color faded but intact. I placed it on the stove and filled it with water. As it began to hum, I realized I was smiling. For the first time in months, maybe years, the sound didn't echo. It simply filled the room. While the tea steeped, I opened my purse and took out the lease, folding it carefully before sliding it into a drawer. It no longer mattered as protection. It was a relic now, a reminder of what I had survived. Next to it, I placed the letter I had written to myself, the one that began, "Evelyn, you are not leaving in defeat." I read it once more, quietly, the words landing differently this time. They no longer sounded like comfort. They sounded like truth. By late afternoon, the apartment had begun to feel like mine. I opened the window to let in the cool air, and somewhere outside, someone was playing music, an old jazz tune I hadn't heard in years. I sat at the small table, poured tea into my chipped cup, and watched people pass on the street below. Couples arguing, children running, a woman walking her dog, all moving through their own stories, unaware of mine. It felt right to be both part of the world and invisible to it, not erased, but unobserved. Freedom, I realized, isn't about being seen. It's about no longer needing to be. As evening came, I lit the lamp by the window, its glow soft and steady. I thought of Jennifer then, not with bitterness, but with a kind of distant compassion. One day, she might understand what she'd done, not as a villain, but as a woman too frightened to face the reflection of her own aging. Maybe she would learn that love built on convenience is a house without foundation. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, I had done my part. I had chosen dignity over dependency, silence over pleading, truth over performance. Before bed, I stepped onto the small balcony and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere, a train passed in the distance, its low hum carrying through the night. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and whispered, almost to myself, "It's done." There was no triumph in the words, only certainty. I had taken back what they thought I'd lost, the right to decide, to move, to exist on my own terms. Tomorrow, I would buy flowers for the window, maybe lavender or mint, something with roots strong enough to grow anywhere. Tonight, I would sleep knowing that for the first time in years, no one could text me out of my home. The days after I moved passed in a strange rhythm, slow but not heavy, like a song I already knew but had forgotten how to hum. The first morning, I woke up before the alarm, expecting to hear the distant noise of children, the slam of a door, Peter's voice echoing across the yard. There was nothing, only the soft ticking of the clock I had brought from the old house, a steady, almost tender sound that seemed to remind me that silence could be gentle, not punitive. The light coming through the window was softer here, as though it understood I was fragile and needed to be handled carefully. I made tea, stood by the open window, and watched the street below waking up. A delivery man pushing a cart of bread to the bakery, a woman shaking crumbs from a tablecloth onto the sidewalk, two schoolgirls arguing about a lost glove. The ordinariness of it all felt miraculous. After years of living as an afterthought, I was suddenly part of the anonymous rhythm of the city. One more woman behind one more window, and that invisibility was the purest relief I had known. In the first week, I did little except walk. I walked without aim, turning corners at whim, letting my feet decide what they wanted before my mind interfered. I bought fruit at the market, stopped to rest in small parks, and watched people without fear of recognition. Every day, I passed the florist's shop under my building, its windows fogged from the warmth inside, the air heavy with the smell of soil and chrysanthemums. The woman who owned it, a stout lady with silver hair and red lipstick, greeted me on my second day. "You're new upstairs," she said. "I can always tell when the air changes." I laughed and told her she was right. She asked my name. When I said Evelyn, she nodded as if she had already guessed it. "That's a strong name," she said. "You look like someone who's lived through too many winters to fear a little cold." I bought a small pot of mint that day. I placed it on my kitchen windowsill, its green leaves catching the sunlight like tiny flags of persistence. It became my morning companion, its scent a reminder that even something uprooted can thrive again. Now and then, a message from Jennifer would appear on my phone. The first came 2 days after I left. "I hope you're okay." I read it and said aloud, "I am." But I didn't reply. The second came a week later. "The kids miss you. Can we visit?" I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. I almost said yes. Then I thought of how easily affection turns into apology into repetition. I deleted the message. There were no more after that. It wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. I had spent years mistaking endurance for love. Now I was learning that sometimes silence is the kindest boundary one can offer. Each day settled into a routine that felt both new and ancient. I read in the mornings, cooked in the afternoons, and in the evenings I sat by the window, watching the light fade across the rooftops. I wrote letters that I never sent, letters to the girl I used to be, to my mother, to Jennifer. They were not bitter letters. They were inventories of truth. I tried to make myself smaller to fit into the shape of their comfort, I wrote once. Now I'm full-sized again, and it frightens no one but those who never wanted to see me clearly. Writing became my quiet reclamation. There is a certain power in narrating your own story after others have misused your silence. One afternoon, the florist invited me for tea in the back of her shop. The room smelled of lilies and damp wood. We talked about small things, weather, neighbors, prices of eggs, but somehow it felt like confession. At one point, she said, "I used to live with my daughter too. She moved me in after her husband died. It lasted 6 months. Then one day I left and never went back." I asked her if she regretted it. She smiled. "Regret is for those who stayed too long," she said. I understood her completely. That night, I slept better than I had in years. In the quiet of my new home, time began to feel forgiving. I found myself humming as I washed dishes, taking pleasure in the small domestic sounds that once felt like burdens. The clink of glass, the rustle of fabric, the low sigh of the kettle. There was no one to tell me these things were meaningless, no one to measure my usefulness by the convenience I provided. Freedom, I discovered, doesn't shout. It whispers, softly but endlessly. It fills the room like air, unnoticed until you realize you're breathing differently. Occasionally, I would dream of the old house. In the dreams, it was never whole. Sometimes it was underwater, sometimes filled with dust, sometimes crumbling from the inside. In one dream, I stood outside the gate, holding a key that no longer fit. When I woke, I didn't feel loss, only distance. The past had become a landscape I could visit, but no longer inhabit. The memory of Jennifer no longer hurt the way it used to. It had turned into a story I could tell myself without trembling. I hoped, quietly, that she had found some peace too. Maybe she looked at the empty space where I used to live and understood something about permanence, that it's not built with walls, but with conscience. As spring crept closer, the mint on my windowsill began to flower. Tiny white blossoms sprouted between the leaves, delicate and defiant. I trimmed one and pressed it between the pages of my notebook, beside the sentence I had written weeks before. You still belong somewhere. Looking at it now, I knew what that meant. Belonging was not about address or family name. It was the act of claiming your own presence without needing permission. On my 67th day in the new apartment, I sat down to write a final entry in the notebook that had followed me through this transformation. I wrote slowly, letting each word settle. I forgive her. Not because she asked, but because I can. Forgiveness is not for those who wronged us. It's the room we build inside ourselves, so the ghosts of others don't take up all the space. I closed the notebook, feeling the lightness that comes only after the last sentence finds its rightful place. That evening, I poured myself a small glass of wine and opened the window to the sound of the city. Somewhere below, laughter drifted from the cafe, mingled with the clinking of glasses. A train passed in the distance, the same low hum I had heard the day I arrived. I leaned against the windowsill, watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. For the first time in a long while, I didn't think of what I had lost, but of what had quietly returned. My voice, my solitude, my ability to stand without explanation. I realized then that the text she had sent, the one that began it all, had not been a sentence of exile. It had been an invitation to rediscover the shape of my own life. I finished my wine, closed the window, and whispered, not as a prayer, but as acknowledgement. I am home. The words filled the room gently, without echo. Because this time, there was no one left to take them away.